To get started with R, the first thing you need to do is install it on your computer. To do this, you can go to posit.co/download/RStudio-desktop. And here you'll see two steps. Step number one is to get the base install of R downloaded. Now, the base install of R comes with a simple console and rudimentary code editor program where you can execute R code. But we're going to layer onto that, and we're also going to follow step 2 to install RStudio. This is a dedicated code editor for working with R. It includes a lot of tools and utilities that you're going to find very useful. And you're going to find that most developers working with R are working with RStudio or some other more advanced editor. So we're going to want to follow both of these options. So jumping right in, let's click the button to download and install R. Here we can see a list of installers depending on your operating system. In my case, I'm on Mac, so I'm going to choose the second option. Then on this page, you want to choose the installer that's appropriate for the OS version that you're running. And that's going to download the installer. So I'm going to go to my Finder window. I'm in my Downloads folder. I'm going to double click the installer, click Continue. This gives me some information about what's going to be installed. I'll click Continue again. Click Continue for the license agreement. Agree to the license agreement. For installation type, I'm just going to leave it as the defaults and click Install. Enter my computer password. Give it a moment for the installation to complete. And then I can close the installer and move it to my trash can. So now if I go over to my applications, I should see that R is installed. So here we see r.app, and I'll just go ahead and quickly load this. And that's going to load up the R console where I have a prompt where I can issue R commands. For a very basic example, one of the most common things you do in any programming language is define and set variables. So let's imagine we wanted to create a variable called X. The way we can assign it to a value in R is we're going to use the less than sign dash. This is the assignment operator. And let's just set it to be the number 10. So now that variable X exists in our R's working memory. So if I were to reference it, so I'm just going to invoke X and hit enter. You can see that R is reporting back what it's set to. And I could work with that variable. Let's say I wanted to do basic mathematical operations on it, multiply it by 2, or square it. You get the idea. Now, we could continue down this path of working with R by just issuing commands directly here in the console, but more typically what you're going to do is create R script files where you're going to put together a bunch of commands, and you're going to want to be able to save those script files so you can pull them up later, edit them. And we could do that with this base R installation. There's ways to create script files and edit them. But remember, we want to be working with the RStudio application just because, as I mentioned, it gives us some extra bells and whistles working with R. So rather than continue to dig into the base R tools that it provides, let's get set up with RStudio. This link here should auto-detect your operating system. And in my case, I'm on a Mac, so you can see the link is customized for that. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that to download RStudio. And with that download complete, I'm going to go to my Downloads folder. There's the RStudio installer. I'll double click that. Drag the RStudio application to my Applications folder. And then let's go into Applications and locate it. So here's RStudio. I'll double click it to open it. Give my computer permission to open the file. And here we are in RStudio. And before I do any work here, I'm going to go close out the base R console that I was working with previously. I'm just going to quit that. I don't want to save my current workspace. I'm going to say don't save. And the reason I did that is I just wanted to emphasize that you don't have to have the base R application running in order to use it once we're working in RStudio. It simply just has to be installed on your computer to use RStudio. We did open up the base application just because I wanted to demonstrate using that console and just confirm it was installed. But moving forward, all you need to do is open up RStudio. And with it installed, let's do a quick tour. The first thing you'll observe is RStudio is built around panes. And by default, in the left pane, we see a console where we can issue R commands, just like we saw with the base R program. There's also tabs in this pane, so I could switch to a terminal. This gives me basic command line access to my computer, and I can also see any background jobs that we might have running, which isn't going to really apply for the work that we're doing, so we're going to leave it on the console. The pane on the top right is defaults to our environment variables. So anytime we create things like variables in R, we're actually going to be able to see them in this pane, and that's going to be really useful. You can see that this pane also has other tabs that you can switch to as needed, but for our purposes, we're mostly going to be sticking to the environment tab. Down below that is, by default, a pane showing our files. So this is showing files on our computer, so we could navigate to different directories, maybe open up data sets, open up R files that we've written. We'll look at some examples of that in a minute. The other thing we'll see down in this pane is things like plots. So when we start to generate plots with our R code, we will see that here. We can manage any packages we have installed. So R, as a programming language, relies a lot on packages, which allow us to basically extend the language and the functionality we get with it. And we do that all via packages. And there's a couple other tabs here we might be touching upon, but for now, I'm going to leave it in the File tab. So that's a basic lay of the land with the different panes, and you can rearrange these panes. You could adjust which panes you're seeing, and that's something you might do as you get more comfortable working with R. But for our purposes, let's just zoom in on the console and just replicate some of the things we saw with the base R console. So just like I did earlier, I'm going to define a variable x, and I'm going to set it to be the number 10, and I'll hit enter to execute that line. And one of the cool things we see in RStudio now is it shows us what the value for x is here in the environment pane. So we could see it's set to 10. And as you might expect, we could update that variable. So let's reassign x. And rather than retyping out this line, I'm going to use the up arrow. And that's going to cycle back through my previously run commands, which is a neat shortcut to be aware of. And let's update this to be 15. So when I execute that, we can see that change is reflected in our environment. So that's the basics of running commands, but remember, one of the reasons we wanted to switch to RStudio was to be able to create script files where we could batch together our commands. So on the top left, I'm going to click this little new icon, and I'm going to create a new R script. That's going to divide my pane on the left, so now I have a code editor up top. And just like I wrote commands in the console, I can now write them in this editor. So let's create another variable. I'm going to call this one y. And then following that, I'm going to invoke a built-in R function called print. And then I'm going to follow that up with parentheses. And in between these parentheses, I can pass any arguments to this function. So what I want R to do is print the value for y. So I'm going to pass it that y variable. So I've got two commands in place, and this file is not currently named or saved. So let's go ahead and take care of that. I'm going to say File, Save As, and I'm just going to put this on my desktop, and I'm going to call it Demo. And note that the extension here is .r. Any R scripts are always going to end in that .r extension. So let's save that. And just to confirm that was saved in the appropriate location in my Files pane, I'm going to navigate to my desktop and just confirm that I see that file there. And if I didn't already have it open, this would be one way that I could open it. I could just click it here. Or of course, I could just go to File, Open File, and locate it on my computer. So now that this file is saved, let's talk about running it. We have two options. Option number one is we can run individual lines or commands at a time. Option number two is we could source or run the entire file, so every command will get executed. Let's look at the latter approach first. I want to run this entire file, and to do that, I'm going to click the source button. Down in the console, we could see the results. All that did was executed a R function called source, where it specified the path to the current file we're working in. And then following that, we see this output of 2. This is coming from this print statement, because we said to print the value for y, which of course is 2. So that's what we see in the console when we source this file. The other side effect of sourcing this file that we can see is that y was set to 2, and we can see that in our environment variables. We now have the variables x and y. And the interesting thing to note about this, even though we source this entire file, that didn't clear our environment variables. So we still have x in our R memory as 15 because we had defined that in the console. And we can even reference that in our script. So let's try to print x as well. And once again, I'm just going to source the entire file. All right, so printed y as 2, and then I printed x as 15. And if you have experience in other programming languages, this might be a little odd at first, because if we look through this file, nowhere do we see x defined. In a lot of other languages, this would create an error. But we have to remember, we have this working environment that we have in R, and because x was already defined, we could reference it in this script. Now, this could be both a very useful feature and also sometimes a little bit of a confusing feature, because let's say we had walked away from this and we had closed out RStudio and we didn't do anything to save any of our environment, which is something you can do. You can save your environment. Let's say we didn't. And just to replicate that, I'm going to click this little broom icon. What that's going to do is it's going to clear my environment. I'm going to click yes just to confirm I want to do that. And now I'm going to source this file again. And you can see we're actually getting an error. It says object X is not found. And that makes sense. We had cleared it from our environment. We hadn't gone back and ran the line that initially set X. So according to R, it just has no idea what X is. So to avoid that sort of problem, logically what we would want to do is include the definition of X here in our script file. Now when we source this entire file, we're no longer going to get an error. We can see X and Y was both set in our environment variables, and we get our print statements below. Now rewinding a bit, I mentioned that when we have script files like this, there's two ways we could run the script or parts of the script. One, we could source the entire file, or we could just run individual lines. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to clear my environment variable again, basically giving us a blank slate. And I'm going to put my cursor on the first line. And then if I hover over this run button, you can see this is going to run the current line or selection. And it shows me a keyboard shortcut for this command, which on the Mac is Command Enter. So I could click that button, or if I hold Command Enter, it's going to execute just that first line. So you can see down here, it executed that line. X is now loaded in my environment variables, and nothing else in this script has happened. So if I wanted to continue with this script, I would follow that process again, either click Run or hold down Command Enter. So now Y is in my environment variables. And then once I get down to my print statements, if I run those individual lines, we can see the output below. And we're not getting any errors because, of course, X and Y are available in my environment. So now that we've seen these two different approaches to how we can execute our code, let's talk about when you would use one over the other. The ability to run individual lines or sections of your code at a time can be really useful when perhaps part of your script is very process intensive. And just to demonstrate this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a couple comments to my file. So comments in any programming language are a way that we can write notes in our code that are not actually going to be executed by our programming language. One way we can write comments in R is to start them with a pound sign. So what I'm going to do here is just write a comment that imagine here we had some process intensive code. For example, loading a 10 gigabyte data set and doing cleanup and filtering on it. All right, and then after that, imagine we had code here that was working with the results of the filtering. Now, if we took the approach where we sourced our file every time we made a change to this second portion of the code where we're just working with the results of the filtering, every time it would have to go through this process of loading up the large data set, doing the cleanup and filtering, and it would just make our development process very slow. However, if we just ran this initially once, then moving forward as we're working on this portion of the code, if we just reran whatever lines that apply here, we wouldn't have to redo this process up here. And that's going to really speed up our workflow. So it's definitely a strategy you want to have in mind, especially as your scripts get more and more complex. Moving on, let's talk about some other key points to know as you're getting started with R. In our code that we've written so far, we used a function called print, and this is one of many functions that just come with R by default. In fact, if you want to see all the available built-in functions, a command you can run is ls. This is the list function. We're going to pass it an argument package base. And what this is going to do is list all the functions within the base R package. And as you can see, there are a lot. It printed out 1,000 different functions, and there's actually 280 more that it's not even showing. So there's a lot of power within the base R language. And if you want to learn about any of these functions, a command you can run is just a question mark followed by the name of the function. For example, let's learn about the save function. So as you can see in the help pane on the right, we now see the R documentation for save. We get a description of what it does, some instructions on how to use it, as well as a list of arguments that it takes. Now, just a quick aside about how I ran that last command to bring up the save documentation, and even the command before where I had it output all of these functions. I ran those commands down here in the console. I didn't run them in my script file. If I wanted to, I could have written them in the script file. So I could have said !save, and then I could run that individual line and it would have had the same effect. But it really is just like a once-off command I wanted to run. It's really not part of this example script that I'm working on, so that's why I ran it in the console. And that's something you'll find yourself doing if you're just like testing a little line of code or you want to bring up some functionality in R. You can run it in the console, but anything you plan on wanting to replicate in the future, it's a good practice to be writing that in your scripts. And then, like I said, you can think of them as like disposable commands. Those you'll run in your console. So let's clear that out up here. And moving on to our next example, I want to talk about data visualizations. This is one of the most common things you're going to be doing in R. So let's see a basic example where we can have R generate a plot of data for us. To quickly demonstrate this, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video, and I've put together a simple plot example. So I'm just going to copy this from the notes. And let's paste that in. And the first thing this code does is generate X and Y values that we can plot. So I define a variable called X values. I set it to be 1:5. And this is going to generate a vector of numbers for us, starting at 1 and going up to 5. And just to show that, I'm going to run this line. And over in our environment, we could see that vector of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Vectors, by the way, are a really important data structure in R that as you get further into R, you're definitely going to learn about. All right, now following that for our Y values, I just took my X values and I squared them. And the cool thing that R is going to do here is it's going to square each of the values in my vector. So I'm going to come up with another vector here with basically just the squared equivalence of what I had in X values. And again, let's just run that to see it. So here is our squared value. So 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 2 is 4, 3 times 3 is 9, etc. So with some sample values to plot, then we're going to use the built-in plot function, which of course, if you want to learn more about, you can just do $plot. There's two options here. You want to go to the first one for the default scatter plot function. And here we can see the first two arguments that we could pass to plot is our X and Y coordinates, which we can learn more about down here. In my case, I pass that as my X values and my Y values. Following that is a bunch of optional parameters we can indicate to customize what our plot's going to look like. So we can do things like add a label for the X and Y axes via the X lab and the Y lab argument, which we can read about that here. We can indicate the color for the points on our plot. We can indicate a title for the plot. And again, all of these things are outlined here in the documentation. But let's go ahead and see what this looks like. So in this case, we actually have multiple lines for this single command. I just spaced them out with each argument on its own line just to make it a little bit clearer. But as long as my cursor is somewhere within this command, I can go ahead and run the run option again, and it's going to run this entire plot. So let's do that. And there we go. Our visualization appears under the plots pane. Now there's a lot you can do with R's base plot function, but when you really get into visualizations, you're probably going to come across a R package called ggplot2. And this is actually a great opportunity because I want to talk a little bit about working with packages in R. So let's use ggplot2 as our example package. Packages in R just provide ways of adding extra functionality to R beyond the base functionality that we get out of the box. Packages are built by other R developers in the community. They make them publicly available, and anyone can take advantage of them. In RStudio, if you go over to the packages pane, you can see which packages are currently installed on your system. And there's quite a few that just come with R by default. But we want to expand on this. Like I said, we want to install ggplot2. One way we could do that is we could click the install button. Here you can see where it's going to install packages from by default, and it's going to be pulling from the CRAN repository, which is like the main repository for R packages. You'd want to go to that repository if you're trying to search for a package, you're not aware of the name of it. That's where you can locate packages. But if you know the name of the package, you could just type in that name here. This is where it's going to install it on your computer. But we're not going to use this interface. Instead, we're going to install it via our code, just so we're aware of how to do that. In a lot of tutorials and documentation, you'll see installing packages via code. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. So let's click cancel. And then over in the console, I'm going to say install.packages. And then I'm going to name it or pass it the name of the package I want to install, which is ggplot2. And I'm going to run that down here in the console. Now, I'm not putting it in the script because this is like a one-time thing I'm going to do just to get this package installed on my computer. It's not something I would want to rerun if I reopen this file down the road. So let's run that. You can see it's going through the process of downloading everything it needs for that package. And then now that it's complete, if we look back at the packages pane, you can see ggplot2 was added to our list of packages. Now, in order to use that package in our script itself, at the very top of the file, I'm going to say library and the name of the package. All right, this is very typical that your libraries or your external packages that you're pulling in, you're going to indicate them at the top of your files. And then let's go ahead and run that line. And you'll notice down in the packages pane, it put a little check mark next to that package, just indicating that this is now currently loaded in my session. So now I can access any of the functionality within ggplot2, whether it be from my script or from the console. And just for a very quick example, once again, I'm going to go back to the notes that accompany this video. We've got an example ggplot we can add to our code. So the first thing we do for this example is we define a data frame, which is another important data structure you're going to learn about in R. We've just got some example X and Y coordinates we want to plot. And then here we're actually invoking the ggplot function that comes with the ggplot2 library. We pass it our data frame and then all sorts of configurations for our plot. And then let's go ahead and make sure we run our data frame so that is in our environment. And then we'll run the plot itself. And there you go. We've got a basic scatter plot with a regression line. This is really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you can do with the ggplot2 library. And speaking of tip of the iceberg, that's really what this video has been in terms of getting started with R. But hopefully it's enough to give you a good foundation as you continue to learn to work with R. And I want to set you off on the right path. So to conclude things, going back to the notes that accompany this video, find the section Roadmap of what to learn next. There's some suggestions here just to, like I said, set you on the right path. The first thing I recommend digging into next is common data types. Data types are a fundamental concept in any programming language, so you want to get familiar with what data types are available in R and how that data is handled. From there, you want to look at some R-specific data structures, things like vectors, lists, matrices, data frames. These are going to be really important when you're working with your data, so you want to get comfortable with them. Moving beyond the basic ingredients of data types and data structures, you're going to get into programming structures that allow you to basically design the flow of your code. You're going to use things like conditionals, loops, functions for encapsulating and writing modular code. If you have experience in any other programming language, this is going to look very familiar in R. And if you're brand new to programming, you're going to want to spend some time getting comfortable with these concepts. And then, of course, you're going to want to learn some basic things like how to read and write files. If you're working with R, chances are you're going to be working with data that you're going to want to import into your R script and do manipulations on it. So that's going to be an essential tool to learn as well. And that's the end of my roadmap. So hopefully this gives you a good sense of where you should head next as you continue down the path of learning R.